Hi, my name is Dan Devine and I'm from Renews, Newfoundland. I'd like to do museums and archives, starting with number 67. We call upon the federal government to provide funding to the Canadian Museum Association to undertake, in collaboration with Aboriginal people, a national review of museum policies and best practices to determine the level of compliance with the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and to make recommendations. Number 68. We call upon the federal government, in collaboration with Aboriginal peoples and the Canadian Museum Association, to mark the 150th anniversary of Canadian Confederation in 2017 by establishing a dedicated national funding program for commemoration projects on the theme of reconciliation. Number 69. We call upon Library and Archives Canada to 1. Fully adapt and implement the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People and the United Nations Joint or English principles as related to Aboriginal people, inalienable rights to know the truth about what happened and why, with regard to human rights violations committed against them in residential schools. Number 2, ensure that its records holdings related to residential schools are accessible to the public. Number 3, commit more resources to its public education materials and programming on residential schools. Number 70, we call upon the federal government to provide funding to the Canadian Association of Archivists to undertake, in collaboration with Aboriginal peoples, a national review of archival policies and best practices to, number 1, determine the level of compliance with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the United Nations Joint or Orillic principles as related to the Aboriginal peoples' inalienable rights to know the truth about what happened and why, with regard to the human rights violations committed against them in the residential schools. Number 2, to produce a report with recommendations for full implementation of these international mechanisms as a reconciliation framework for Canadian archives.